So please allow me to introduce Dr. Louise Gyler. She is a child and adult training analyst of the Australian Psychoanalytical Society, where she chairs the Standing Committee for Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis and is a deputy president of the Australian Psychoanalytical Society. She is a senior consultant at Gunavira, that's how you pronounce it? Gunavira maybe, yes? Ganawira, okay. Ganawira, a center for Aboriginal mothers and babies, and a visiting professor at the Chinese American Continual Training Program, Wuhan Hospital for Psychotherapy. She is a member of the IPA and a guest member of the British Psychoanalytical Society. She has published papers on gender and women and is the author of The Gendered Unconscious: Can Gender Discourses Subvert Psychoanalysis? By the way, her book is for sale outside. In 2007, she won the Tiho Charitable Foundation Lectureship Award, runner-up, at the 45th Congress International Psychoanalytic Association in Berlin for her paper, Who Are You? Action, Play, and Working Through in the Analysis of a Young Child. She has a private practice in Sydney, and in addition to all this, I would like really to appreciate your effort for coming from Australia during these unpleasant times that happen so often in our country. Thank you very much.
All right. Good morning. Have I got the mic? Good. Thank you, Alina, for the introduction. And I would just like to say before starting, it's my honour and privilege to receive the Tustin Memorial Lectureship. I would also like to congratulate Alina for her new role as chair of the Tustin Trust, and also to thank the board of the Tustin Trust, I think for myself, and I think on behalf of all of us here who work with patients who suffer greatly and who we find difficult to treat, but yet their only hope of some sense of aliveness and vitality does rest with a long, agonising analytic process. And I think the Tustin Trust represents and symbolises that for all of us. So thank you. And I'm sure, Alina, I'm sure it's not an easy task to keep alive a trust, a foundation, and to keep it alive and functional. So to Alina and the board, thank you.
The lecture that Louise will read is both in English and in Hebrew in the brochures that you have, so you can follow. It will not be screened. But I'd just like to say before I start, I was a bit nervous about coming to Israel for my first visit because of your troubles. However, I've found being in Tel Aviv and visiting various places in Israel an amazing experience. And I'm looking forward to my next visit. So I think I agree with Alina, you just keep on going. As Alina said, my paper's rather a long paper, and it's really divided, I think, particularly in two parts. The first part really captures the clinical experience and clinical phenomena of working with a patient. The second part really attempts to conceptualize some of the clinical phenomena that I'm trying to describe and say something about the symbolizing process. So I'll now begin my paper.
Like most Australians, I probably speak English too quickly, so if people are trying to follow me in English, yell at me if I'm talking too quickly. I won't be offended. The title of my paper, The Violence of the Real, borrows a phrase from Francis Bacon used to explain his artistic intention to reinvent realism, to make the violence of the real, or the brutality of the fact, visible as well as emotionally tangible. Bacon's work exposed in raw and visceral forms, as White writes, an undirected energy that brings forth life as vitality, and also a destructive force that annihilates all differentiation, transforming it into pure, unarticulated matter. This, of course, is akin to the life and death instincts of psychoanalysis, but I would like to set aside the issue of causation and use the expression to emphasize both the sense of aliveness and the opposition to separateness that resides mostly in all of us. When the presence and absence of this emotional force cannot be represented for whatever reason, we are left with severe lacks and deficiencies in our capacities for verbalizing, symbolizing, employing projective identification, and making emotional contact with another. Those patients suffering these defects and lacks are commonly described as having psychotic, autistic, and schizoid aspects to their personalities. Such patients, contra to the values of present-day culture for the quick fix, for the ever-changing stimuli, for movement and momentum, are prepared to exist in a kind of suspended timelessness. This poses a problem for an analysis which values and privileges time and space to reflect, or reverberation time as described by Dana Berkstedt-Breen, as it dovetails too closely with the patient's defensive use of time. That is, rather than conceiving time and memory as generative, they see it as traumatic. These patients inhabit a sensuous and timeless world where words do not appear to have a transformative and fully symbolic function. They present as feeling terribly alone in both their inner and outer worlds. They're caught in an impasse between the avoidance of emotional pain and dependency and a terrible fear of isolation and fragmentation. Neither emotional connection nor separateness can be tolerated. On the surface, these patients appear to negate a world of internal objects, of internalizing anything of value, no paternal function with limits, boundaries, and the passing of time, whilst at a deeper level maintaining a refusal and or an inability to symbolize the maternal object. They're caught in the drama of a never-ending, lawless world. At the same time, this state of nothing, that is, a thing in itself, rather than the recognition of absence necessary for symbolization, is both desired and feared, leading these patients, I suggest, to attempt to use their analyses as an encapsulated space, a carefully controlled and static environment to keep them alive. Yet these analyses have paradoxical aims. On the one hand, there is to be no psychic movement with the obliteration of time past and future. On the other, some movement is necessary to avoid the catastrophic despair of non-existence. When some traction on a sense of an alive inner world is emotionally experienced, the patients become overwhelmed with the threat of intrusion and violence, and there is a regression to the nothing state. For the analyst, this nothing state is usually experienced as very perturbing and alien, either because felt emotions are experienced as deadened, or conversely, feelings are over-aroused. During and after sessions, the analyst is often left troubled and tormented by the sense that something is missing. Butler and Butler suggests this experience reflects the patient's experience of non-representation. It differs, for example, from the experience of over-closeness linked with enclaves described by O'Shaughnessy, and sadness associated with empty spaces described by Perelberg. But like the descriptions of empty spaces and enclaves, these analyses risk becoming a substitute for life. Margaret Ruston writes of the importance of keeping in mind that the structured reliability of the analytic setting is double-edged for certain patients because, to quote, the regular sessions can become part of the patient's organised evasion of life. I'll now say something about symbolisation. In such analyses, the tripart structure of the analyst and psychoanalysis is crucial, but constantly at risk of deforming and collapsing. For example, we can become over-identified with the patient's passivity, apparent helplessness, and deadness, and join them too fixedly in their concrete worlds, surrendering our own freedom to associate, think, and articulate understandings. Alternatively, we can become too stirred up with frustration and over-identify with the patient's punitive superego. This can result in an intellectualizing and moralizing style of interpreting, or even in the belief that it is in the service of being firm, we prematurely set a termination date. In these continually collapsed spaces with thin but adhesive transferences, symbol formation is limited and often difficult to discern if present. With an insufficient sense of separateness, symbolism, when it occurs, usually takes the form of symbolic equations where the thing to be symbolised and the sign symbol are equated, as Hannah Siegel wrote about. Klein saw symbolic equations as a potential resource for developing true symbols, invested with fantasies, writing, to quote, owing to this equation, these in their turn become objects of anxiety. And so he is impelled constantly to make other and new equations, which form the basis of his interest in the new object and of symbolism, to end quote. Ricardo Steiner has noted that in the Kleinian tradition, the same terminology is used for normal and pathological developments in symbolization. For example, he notes that there is no language to classify aberrant symbolic equations. Hannah Siegel does descriptively make a distinction between the failure to form symbols, as described by Klein in her 1930 description of her patient Dick, and the formation of a symbol that cannot function as a symbol, for example, in Hannah Siegel's own example of Edward. I suggest that how we differentiate conceptually the chronic intransience of some symbolic equations from that have the potential to initiate the process of symbolization is a complicated clinical issue, as it mostly likely relates to some ineffable quality of the intersubjective analytic space. That is, the symbolizing potential relies on the other object's capacity for receptiveness and understanding. Roussillon elaborates that in the analytic encounter, the analyst object is both an object to be symbolized and a function for symbolizing. Authors from different psychoanalytic models have suggested the conceptual dichotomy of symbol proper and symbolic equation is perhaps not sufficiently nuanced to capture the early signs of symbolic development. In this regard, the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce's theory of semiotics is considered a useful resource to orient the clinician to the early signs of symbolic development. Peirce's theory of semiotics encompasses not only verbal utterances, but unformulated phenomena such as emotions, images, and action. His theory proposes a diachronic, tripartite structure of signs. Firstly, the sign, which can have three forms, and I'll return to that. Secondly, the object that the sign stands for. And third, the interpreter, that is, the sense made of the sign, with the interpreter in an iterative and expansive process becoming the object in the next semiotic series. The three types of signs that Peirce described are icon, for example, likeness, empathy, and enacted iconicity. The index, as in the proximity of ideas in time and space, and the symbol, as in the conventional usage of the term. Iconic and indexial phenomena capture emerging properties of thought, akin to Kristeva's notion of pre-narrative envelopes. In my limited experience of attempting to apply Peirce's semiotic framework to clinical material, the categories and distinctions often dismantle because of the complexity of lived moments. For example, Muller extends the formal Peircean properties of the terms to include complex states such as empathy in his description of enacted iconicity. But from a philosophical perspective, I understand this is a very contentious move. Along similar lines, Maiello has proposed that the capacity for thought develops by means of a three-stage model of conceptual development. And to quote Maiello, the theory of conceptual development has to be extended to include not only the growth of a number of and scope of concepts, but also the growth of each single concept through three stages. A stage of concrete representation, which strictly speaking is not representational at all, since no distinction is made between the representation and the object or the situation represented. A stage of ideographic representation, as in dreams, and a final stage of conscious and predominantly verbal thought. According to Maiello, this process can be impeded either by the failure to internalize a container-contained relationship, in which an infant's projections can be transformed by maternal reverie into less toxic forms, or by the mind being so saturated with misconceptions that there is no space for empty thoughts. I'm proposing that Maiello's model may contribute to extending our thinking about the phases in the symbolizing process, especially for patients whose functioning is dominated by autistic and archaic states of mind. In these patients, their capacity to symbolize often develops slowly and in a fragile and limited ways, and it is important for the analyst to be able to register and respond to these developments in the clinical encounter. In this paper, I plan to track the evolution of the concept of relationality through the clinical discussion of a patient who remained mostly silent for many years of his long analysis. For me, his silence brought into being an underlying potent and frightening states in all their stark reality. In a way, the silence strips bare elements of the analytic counter and concentrates the horror and violence of both the patient's and my inner reality and the analytic lived experience. And it's this lived experience that the violence of the real evokes. My patient, William, has a predominantly schizoid and autistic-like mode of being, especially the sense of dwelling in a glassed-off inner world. Francis Bacon's Head 6 conveys something of this inner situation. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I've got...
You want it on full screen?
Doesn't. This painting depicts a space that conveys both power and restriction. On one hand, power represented by the authority of a pope, no less, and on the other, of encasement and restriction. In the painting, the Pope's scream, an unintelligible discharge along with a gaping mouth and hollow eyes, proclaim the sense of panic, abjection, and despair. This leads to a series of questions. What motivates the terror? And is the encapsulation an attempted solution or an imposed entrapment? Is the fear of the other who is unable to contain the terror, so imprisonment is sought as a solution to non-existence? Or is it the fear of the awfulness of one's own aggression and violence, so imprisonment and punishment is sought? Or is it the result of a lived life in an imprisoned state cut off from human connectedness? But leaving aside the motivational uncertainties, what is apparent is the aloneness, the sense of disconnection and fear. I suggest that analyses of such patients become, as it were, an externalization of the patient's inner encapsulated experience, used both to constrain their violent and terrifying affects and to express in defended ways their need for recognition and understanding. I shall now turn to the case example. First, I'm going to describe the clinical situation where no or limited contact appeared possible, and I experienced being trapped at times in an unintelligible space, and at the other in a deadly one. In the second part, I'm going to recount 3 progressive moments in the analysis that represented some emergence from this trapped space and a movement towards symbolisation and thought, in an attempt to illustrate Moneycall's model of conceptual development. I hope to show the transformation from the use of an analysis as a capsulated space, that is, an analytic process conceived as it just is, to secure survival, a symbolic equation in Klein and Siegel's terms, to one where some level of symbolic as-ifness of the analytic relationship self and other is possible. So the clinical example. William was referred at age 17 and was spending his days in bed, apparently mostly sleeping and perpetuating a sensuous, timeless world unbounded by the differentiation between day and night, wakefulness and sleep. Had not long been discharged with a difficult to diagnose but not schizophrenic diagnosis from a psychiatric adolescent unit after a long admission. Of the long admission, he reported that this period was the safest he'd felt in his life, and it was this verbalisation that captured my attention, leading me to think about the possibility of the provision of an analysis as a safe space. Since discharge and before commencing his analysis, there had been serious suicide attempts, including walking into the ocean. He presented on assessment as depressed, despairing and helpless. He could give a history, but overall it sounded rather rehearsed and well-worn and in accord with his parents' account. William had a long history of childhood vulnerability on a background of interparental conflict and of sleeping in his mother's bed until he was 8 years of age. Following the assessment, William accepted my offer of analysis and the use of the couch. The analysis soon developed as an externalised version of William's inner retreat, with the frequency of the sessions providing a rhythm of safety. He experienced holiday breaks as a disruption to his routine rather than as a loss of the analyst present. Any disruption caused panic and fear that he would not survive. In sessions, he was mostly silent and passive, waiting for me to ask a question, as he put it. My attempt to talk with him, however, were met with silence, physical responses such as a shrug, or verbal responses such as don't know or nothing. Occasionally he might offer up an utterance such as geometric patterns, but on inquiry he was unable to elaborate, and my attempts at meaning making went apparently unrecognised and or were deadened. This type of utterance appeared to function somewhat like an internal version of an autistic object. That is, he appeared to be using his mind to whirl round with this hard object to numb his awareness of terrifying anxieties. My talking disturbed his comfortable drifting state of mind, that he drifted as if lost in space in his own inner world. In his sessions, he claimed, quote, "If I talk aloud, my thoughts go away. If I did press my separate existence, he dissolved into non-existence." I think that this state was concretely enacted in his walking into the ocean. At other infrequent times, there was an awareness of otherness, and in this state, my talk was met with irritation at best and contempt and paranoia at worst. It seemed he believed that he was entitled to dwell in his object in a very particular way. There was to be no outside place, no thinking, so as to evade any sense of frustration. His chronic, prolonged silences were experienced in the countertransference, at times without form, conveying a sense of lostness, and at others as a motivated attack on any link to his mind or to me, and generating an atmosphere of hostility and persecution. While there were variations of the emotional climate in his session, there was a pervasive sense of non-movement. Just to give an example, about 6 months into his analysis, a conflict emerged for William in his inner world, between a cold, clinical, cynical controller who sees nothing and another saner part wishing for change. For example, he said, "I don't know what I want. I don't want to be bothered yet. I feel lonely." Utterances such as this one were nevertheless rare in the early years. His sleeping and even at times snoring was more usual. I shall describe a session from around this time where a conflict and projective processes were more evident. The session begins with William arriving on time. Indeed, I imagine he's been waiting for quite a while for his session to start. He enters the consulting room and lies on the couch without acknowledging me. There is a silence for almost 10 minutes when I decide to speak, saying that he appears to be in a place in his mind where he doesn't want to be disturbed. William startles. I then say that when I speak, it frightens him because in his mind, he's given over to me all the bad and disturbed thoughts. This means that when I begin to speak, he feels that I'm shooting them back to him. He responds with a slight shrug, and then there is another period of silence for about 5 to 10 minutes. Again, I break the silence by speaking. At the sound of my voice, he almost jumps out of his skin with shock. He momentarily recognises some sense of separateness between us, challenging his fantasy of fusion. I say that he so hates the idea of anything happening between us, so as to stop any contact, he shuts down and goes to sleep. But this leaves him very frightened that I'm angry with him. He doesn't respond. Next, after some minutes, I speak saying that part of him is very frightened of making me angry at his sleeping and shutting me out, and another part is very satisfied with his sleeping because he believes there's a war going on in the room between us. After a moment, I continue that the war is between what he sees as my way to talk and relate and his way to shut down and to live in an inside place. He makes a slight movement that I consider indicates that he's heard me. He doesn't respond verbally. A lengthy silence ensues. I break the silence with the verbal observation that I can see that he's much in his way, sleeping, shutting down, and allowing no contact. The session ends a little later, and he leaves, unusually acknowledging me, saying, "See you on Monday." In the Monday session, he's more communicative, perhaps suggesting something of the previous session penetrated his silent retreat. There were many similar sessions going on and on for years. I experienced a terrible bind in working with William, where my attempts to engage verbally with him appeared to be experienced as intrusive, putting pressure on him, and intensifying his distrust. For example, that he said that if he was open to communicating with me, I suppose my thoughts might get stolen. On the other hand, not to attempt to reach him was experienced as my lack of interest in him, leaving him alone and isolated in some frightening, weird inner world. As William put it, words are too real. That is, they were experienced as the equivalent of physical actions or symbolic equations. Any use of words appeared to stand for a concretely experienced enactment, that it either caused suffering or, if they did fleetingly bring relief, the transformative potential of the emotional contact could easily miscarry and be converted into concretised dead facts, in contrast with the potentially generative selected facts. For example, he conveyed his contempt and confusion for my approach, giving the story that when an arrow wounded a soldier, he just wanted it taken out and didn't want others to stand round talking about it. William made it clear he just wanted relief and that my words got into him like arrows, hurting and disturbing his inner refuge. For him, words were arrows just to be pulled out without any full symbolic meaning, although the visual imagery might be thought to be an intermediate stage in the symbolising process, that is, something between a symbolic equation and a symbol proper. William appeared very satisfied with this communication, which made it clear that he was not to be marked by experience. The questions about the nature of these word arrows resided with me. Questions such as who fired the arrow, who was the hunter, who was the injured one, and what was the nature of the wound and the damage. In William's mind, who was so muddled and interchangeable because of the rapid-fire projective cycles. In the early years of working with William, I had an extraordinary experience in a session. I had the urge to reach out and place my hands around his neck and strangle him. I experienced this murderous urge or wish as an idea to act in a physical way, not as a feeling or fantasy. I experienced a visceral desire to do violence. This experience did not appear to change the nature of subsequent sessions. It prefigured no transformational moment. It did affect me profoundly, as I imagined my extreme, concrete state of mind figured what was at stake for William. I was left to ponder who was murdering whom. I've pondered for years on the motivation for this murder. Initially, when I reflected on the nature of my hatred, I thought of it as raw violence of a paranoid schizoid position, but later I wondered about the possibility of hatred also fused with love and concern, something between or bringing together the paranoid, schizoid and depressive positions, akin to the state of the mind of the distressed and depressed mother who is at the limits of bearable grief and anguish, of a reality that can no longer be faced. For example, in those cases of infanticide where the infant is disabled and suffering. But my hallucinatory psychic activity is perhaps best understood as a regressive non-verbal experience that represents my working as a double to William's experience and represents what Patella and Patella refer to as a work of psychic figurability. As time passed, the negative transference became more organised, with William conceiving his transferential object as hostile to him, a parasite who not only did nothing for him, but also did not need him. This left him feeling arrogant, suspicious, and violent. He appeared to exist between the poles of autistic-like withdrawal and of violence without any object to hold him. He did worry at times that he might kill someone if he exploded, but in the early years he always denied that it would be me. He seemed to live on a terrible tightrope between non-existence and the fantasy of explosive violence, states of intolerable suffering that both threatened his psychic survival and at times his life. Although from the beginning of his analysis, there was only one very non-serious attempt at self-harm. The idea of a murderous figure was elaborated years later when William reported his first dream. At this time, there'd been some movement in his external life. He'd completed his matriculation and had started university. He harboured the suspicion if he'd made progress in his life, I would exploit this to abandon him. He dreamt, to quote, "I was a Terminator, not the Terminator, hunting down monstrosities. When I asked for his associations, he continued that the monstrosities were not frightening, but that he was worried about what they might do to other people, hurt them, drive them mad. He continued that the Terminator was moving from place to place along a road or a bridge, perhaps the harbour bridge, hovering, flying above the cars. He further said he often had dreams in which something flies. He talked about a sense of something just keeping on going. In the dream, the only thing that can move is the Terminator, standing for a figure that hovers over him, threatening to terminate himself or his analysis. In the transference, I become a watching hunting figure, ready to terminate him or his analysis if he dared to move. The bridge appeared to represent his position where he was stuck in some strange borderline state, not able to move on for fear of attack. For years, William continued bringing his powerful silence to his analysis. It gradually became clearer that sometimes the silence captured his state of no way out and lostness and apathy. That is, he would rather lose himself in a sensuous, autistic-like retreat than risk emerging from his retreat to find a murderous explosion. He believed that he had the choice between a sensuous bedroom scene with the prospects of no future development or the anguish of a violent abandoning world. William both feared attack from within and without, and in the last years of his analysis, he was quite forthright about his belief that I might physically attack him. At other times, the silence was more consciously motivated and represented his ongoing battle and grievances with me as a malignantly misunderstanding object that he was punishing by destroying his life. In this complex constellation, there appeared no good object, no good couple, and a collapsed sense of thirdness. The transformative process with my patient was uncertain and limited, and I shall now focus on the types of transformations that were possible, which gave some hope to the idea of keeping on going in a progressive way. I want to illustrate the keeping on going through three moments in William's analysis, named the tear, the dream, and the mental image, or in terms of Manicoule's model, a concrete representation, an ideographic representation, and a verbal thought, which represent different and enlarged ways of symbolising his relationship to the glassed-off state of mind and the here and now analytic encounter. The somatic event, the dream, and the mental image capture William's the way William represented his relational orientation. So the first one, the somatic event. Some years into William's analysis, I announced a break not in keeping with my usual routine. After a pause, William responded by saying he was thinking of taking a 1-week break in a few weeks' time, as he had the opportunity to holiday with friends, as this was the only time the holiday house was available. William rarely missed a session, I think like less than a handful in a very long analysis. He was then silent for several minutes. I decided to initiate speaking. I said that I noticed that when I announced my upcoming break, he seemed to jump over registering it and instead spoke of his own break, perhaps to block out of his mind his feelings about my break, and that my break would disrupt him. And from previous work, William and I had understood the routine of the sessions was very important to him, even if when in the session he might not speak to me. William was silent. As I waited for about 15 minutes, another thought occurred to me about William's holiday announcement. I then said that I thought he was wanting to tell me about his desire to be like me, someone who had studied, worked, and holidayed with family and friends. William responded by saying, a tear. That is, he was referring to a tear that was running down his face. In this sequence, the analyst moves out of routine, and William imitates the analyst by doing likewise. We see William responding to the analyst's break by substituting his own break to negate its disruptive impact on him. The analyst's interpretation points to the denial of separateness, but this interpretation falls flat, becoming a nothing. In the ensuing silence, I have a thought about desire, which I articulate to the patient. William responds with a somatic production, a tear that leaks out of his walled-off silence. The tear communicates that William has been touched emotionally. A tear potentially condenses a variety of meaning. For example, we cry with joy, we cry in grief, sadness, and pain. It signs a likeness to a feeling state, an emotional connection. I could imagine that William's tear communicated his relief at being understood as an individual with desires and aspirations, but also his sadness and grief and uncertainty about his future and whether his desires would be realised. At this moment in his analysis, William expresses himself non-verbally through a somatic production, with his poignant effects leaking out of his walled-off prison into a more relational space. He's also able to name the somatic experience. In this analytic exchange, we could think of it as an iconic enactment. The second stage, the dream. During his analysis, William rarely reported dreams, although in the last years he perhaps reported one every few months. Many years after the tear moment of contact, William started a session by describing how he had experienced the previous day as difficult because he had struggled to stay motivated at work. He went on to report the following dream. He said, to quote, "I had a dream last night, but only remember fragments. In the dream, I was carrying gelignite, but it must have been nitroglycerine. I was carrying it in a bottle that's a brand name in Australia called, the water's called Mount Franklin, but he misnamed it as Mr. Franklin's water. A very thin bottle which might be all right for carrying water." He continued, "I was carrying the bottle in the dream and I knew I had to be very careful, but I did spill some on my hand and it was burning my hand. I can't remember anymore." William's association to the dream was that something needed containment, but it was being held in a flimsy way. He then remembered a further dream fragment. "I was in a holiday house with friends and I said something to one of my friends that caused offence. The offensive claim, was going to be published in a newspaper." William then went on to say he was not sure in the dream whether he intended to give offence or whether he was trying to be helpful, but the friend took offence. "I observed the ambiguity around his intentionality in the dream and a little later connected this with the flimsy inside state where he fears he cannot contain any negative feelings, that is, they spill out, causing damage." William added it was not just negative feelings, but also positive ones that gave trouble. He said that there was always a backlash, by which he meant a punitive self-attack, if he experienced strong feelings. I then interpreted that he was trying to let me know that he believed he carried an explosive bomb inside him and that he was uncertain about my ability to keep us safe. Later in the session, I added that he felt his attempt to protect by cutting off contact with me would offend me. This left him feeling that I shall judge and publicise his badness. William replied with an enthusiastic yes, saying, "I always judge me too." After this point of contact, William moved away emotionally and became excited by his suffering. The backlash was in action. In this dream, we see something of William's representation of his inner world. As well, he appears more present and alive in the session than in the Tier 1. The dream, which does not have a fully as-if quality, carries a warning to his analysis that if she attempts to get too close, his dangerous emotions will spill out in a destructive way. We see his belief that in action there is no sense of real containment, for he's a deadly emotional life, only publicised condemnation. Third, the mental image. In one of the final weeks... Slower. Thanks. In one of the final weeks of William's analysis, he described what he referred to as a mental image. He started his session by talking about his plans for his summer holiday, and then said he felt dull and flat. I commented that he jumped over the ending of his analysis. William then described accurately the number of sessions remaining. He continued that he didn't know what to say, and that he had an impulse to, quote, go still and silent and flatten things out. Further, he observed that it was hard to stay engaged and, to quote, to find things to hang on to, just a big empty space that will swallow everything up, a hole in the world. After a pause, he went on to say, I guess I am anticipating missing you, missing being here, a hole, something missing. I talked to him about his despair that he might not be able to keep alive an image of me and our work together, and in its place there would be a hole. He responded that it was difficult enough to keep our contact alive when we were together in the room. He continued to quote, I just had a mental image of two people working in a jar, and they wanted to open it, but one was not strong and was turned in the wrong direction, making it harder for the other person. When I asked him for his thoughts about this image, he said that the two people are you and I, me, and I put myself in the position of the first person working hard in the wrong direction, and that makes it difficult for everyone. Here, William is recognising his desire to leave the restricted jar space, a version of the encapsulation, his awareness that he can work in the wrong direction by turning away from contact, and his understanding that this may create difficulties for others in relating to him. After this moment of contact, William reported that he'd wandered off to think about spirals, helixes, springs and scars. That is, he'd returned to his autistic-like world. In subsequent sessions, William could return from spiralling away from contact and talk about the positive developments that occurred during his analysis of his inner world transformations. He included, to quote, much better awareness of how important relationships are to me, more able to see the destructive shutting down pattern, and that when it does happen, it doesn't surprise me. That is, he is no longer completely overwhelmed and helpless. In another session, he talked about his propensity for anger and shutting down, saying, to quote, always wonder whether that part of me will always be there, better now, can understand. Back then, so alone, no one to talk with about it, no perspective, no, that's not the right word, no understanding, no resilience, no strength. He also talked about how important it would be not to leave his analysis in the wrong way. By this he meant he wanted to turn to his analyst and risk offering his hand for her to shake in a goodbye gesture. Poignantly, after a long analysis, William struggles with the uncertainty as to whether his positive transferential feelings are acceptable to his analyst. Through these examples, the tear, the dream, and the mental image, a transformative process in action is seen, a movement from a concrete representation to a dream to a verbal thought. William's tear is an iconic indexial sign of his emotional response, which leads to the understanding that in that moment of his wish for connection, he moves from his encapsulated, relationally disconnected inner world to a relational world where he wishes to identify with the other in an imitative way. In the dream, William's relational mode is further expanded and is elaborated through anxieties about misunderstanding, destructiveness, and safety. He is concerned centrally with the problem of containment. Is his destructiveness too great to be contained? Is the analyst container strong enough to manage his emotional life? And can there be a safe relational space for understanding? Tustin has described how autistic reactions defend against deep-seated traumatic effects that exist in the somatic psyche, like an unexploded bomb. In the mental image, William recognises his autistic-like propensity to turn away from relating, and he appears to have overcome his sense of persecution. Alvarez argued that it represents a significant step when paranoid phenomena can be separated from schizoid ones in such patients as William. In the tear, the dream, the mental image, we see the development of an idea about the nature of relationality. In the non-verbal bodily gesture of the tear, elements such as contact, emotive identification, and tenderness can be found. In the dream, deadly and explosive affects with only flimsy, ineffective containment, and in the mental image, a sense of two-ness rather than isolation, albeit not a cooperative twosome, but along with this, there's also a sense of awareness and concern. There is a transformation in William's object relational world. At first, William is glued to the analyst as a function, like an incubator to keep going. In the tear example, there's a need for sameness, which is both defensive, but also I think we can think of it as emotive, as in infant development, which is necessary to provoke development. In the mental image example, there is a representation of difference, even if it's a representation of his weak internal situation. I'm not suggesting that these transformations represent a simple chronological unfolding, but rather they represent the work of a complex dynamic process that is instigated by the transference-countertransference relationship. Towards the end of his analysis, William no longer relies solely on non-verbal projective modes to communicate, but can articulate his inner experience, which points to an expansion in his ego capacities. William is in contact with his ongoing struggle to stay in contact with an alive and vital inner and outer world. His version of aliveness is experienced by him at times as deadly as nitroglycerine, with no sense of adequate containment. In Bion's terms, the container and the contained, always in a dynamic relationship, are problematic, leaving him uncertain about his relational capacities. For example, working in the wrong direction to move out of the jar. Nevertheless, William can think and articulate his dilemma through the mental image. He can share his experience. He is no longer surprised by this state of mind, and he is not left in a state of frozen and hopeless collapse where he believes the only way out is death or non-existence. With some self-experiential understanding, he has a better capacity to struggle for himself to stay in the right orientation. Nevertheless, at the end of his analysis, William's representational capacities are insecurely formed. There is a debate just in concluding, there's a debate, as you know, in psychoanalytic theorising between the so-called deficit or models of inadequate early containment and motivated conflict models. I suggest that this is a false dichotomy for thinking about patients such as William, as the problem for William and for them is not either or, but both. I suggest for William both his inability to represent his experience and a motivated refusal to do so by attacks on linking and twine to motivate the experience of terror. This makes it very challenging to find a sufficiently calibrated register to connect with these patients and to find a meaningful relational distance. The psychoanalytic clinical literature has a rich tradition of describing the development of the symbolic process. Terms such as pre-symbolic, symbolic equations, pseudo-symbols, asymbolic, and desymbolization are commonly deployed to convey states of mind where symbols do not function as conventional symbols. Psychoanalysts usually rely on their countertransference responses to parse clinical phenomena, for example, to distinguish archaic states of mind capturing autistic phenomena with their meaningless, very sensual and repetitive patterns from those that may hold the possibility to advance a nascent symbolic process. I suggest that greater understanding of semiotic accounts may contribute to the analyst's understanding in identifying such distinctions. Further, I suggest that the understanding, of more nuanced conceptual resources may implicitly interact with our emotional attitude to the patient to allow more empathic responses. For example, capturing the different types of emotional connections that were possible in the clinical examples, the different connections I could make in the arrow example and the tear vignette. I'm left with the question about what enabled emotional contact between the patient and me in the tear experience as opposed to the arrow one. Additionally, I propose that the analyst's implicit and explicit responsiveness and attitudes are significantly implicated in whether over time a patient's symbolic equation becomes a potential resource or an aberrant phenomena. The intersubjective analytic context then complicates the development and reliability of how we conceive formal conceptual categories. We can develop conceptual models, but the way they pass in clinical practice is dependent on the nature of the relationship between analyst and patient. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to that long paper.
Okay, so in this panel, we will start with a discussion of Dr. Suzanne Maiello, and afterwards we will have time for questions and remarks and responses from the audience. So please allow me, first of all, to introduce to all of you Dr. Suzanne Maiello, who is a psychoanalyst and psychoanalytic child psychotherapist. She is a founder member and past president of the Italian Association of Psychoanalytic Child Psychotherapy. She is a member, can we have silence please? She is a member of the IAAP, that is the International Association of Analytical Psychology, and of the Association of Child Psychotherapists, Tavistock Section, United Kingdom. She is faculty of the AIPPI postgraduate training in psychoanalytic child psychotherapy in Rome and Milan, of Master in Psychoanalytic Observational Studies at Tavistock and at University of Essex, UK, and of postgraduate training in psychoanalytic child psychotherapy in Istanbul. Between 1978 and 1980, she was in supervision with Francis Tustin on the treatment of an autistic child. In 1997, she was the recipient of the first International Francis Tustin Memorial Prize. She is editor and co-author of books and author of over 100 publications in the leading journals of psychoanalytic child psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She is member of international advisory boards of European psychoanalytic journals. Her main areas of interest are prenatal auditory and kinesthetic experience and memory, prenatal proto-mental development, relation between early trauma and autistic spectrum disorder. She lives and practices in Rome, Italy, and as I said to Louise, who came from so far apart, I don't think distance has importance here, but the courage and the dedication that brought Suzanne to us here in these difficult times. So thanks a lot again. The discussion and its translation into Hebrew are in the brochures, so you can follow.
Okay. So let me first of all thank the board of the Francis Tustin Memorial Trust and its president, Alina Shelikes, for the honor to be the discussant of Louise Gyler's rich and evocative paper, with which she won the 2019 edition of the Francis Tustin Memorial Prize. Congratulations, Louise. I feel not only honored, but deeply involved every time I'm invited to speak in a context connected with Francis Tustin and her work. When I revisit her writings, I discover ever new facets of her creative thinking. She has been my supervisor of my first autistic child patient, exactly 40 years ago, and continues to this day to be, to me, a source of inspiration. My discussion paper will be centered around the most primitive aspects of Louise's adolescent patient's personality and on his presumably very early autistic retreat. And my comments will connect Louise's rich clinical material with Francis Tustin's theoretical contributions. Tustin's courageous pioneering work has allowed all of us to reach a deeper understanding not only of autism, but also of normal, primitive psychophysical states, which must, I underline, be differentiated. We may go back to this in the discussion. And my contribution will be mainly to the clinical material which Louise presented. William's analysis started after more than one psychotherapeutic failure and after receiving what we might call a negative psychiatric diagnosis which labeled him as not schizophrenic. I suggest that this young man is a living example of what can occur over the years when a child's autistic state is not recognized and treated early in his life. Over time, William had developed one of those complex, confused, and confusing pathological organizations around his autistic core, what I believe was his autistic core, which John Steiner describes as psychic retreats. In these cases, experience shows that our most reliable diagnostic tool is the countertransference. Louise Gyler describes her sense of exclusion and the hard-to-bear emotional impact of William's, I quote her, silent, autistic-like inner world, the frozen dimensions of space and time, his, I quote her again, inhabiting a sensuous and timeless world and being in a nothing state with the catastrophic despair of non-existence. Now, the first brief subtitle will be Ocean, Spilling and Dissolving. William entered his analyst, what I call the analyst's harbor, after serious suicide attempts, including walking into the ocean. Shortly after being discharged from the psychiatric adolescent unit, where, as he said, he had spent several months. William reported that his time in the unit had been, I quote William through Louise, the safest he had felt in his life, as if he had never before felt contained. As a young child, he had slept with his mother until the age of 8. We can only wonder whether his clinging to his mother's body had been the result of early experiences of a missing or insufficient psychophysical containment. Tustin reports that all mothers of her caseload of autistic children had been clinically depressed during pregnancy or in the prenatal period. Beyond's notion of the dynamic relation between container and contained includes the maternal capacity for reverie, which is the prerequisite for the child's experience of being safely harbored in mother's love and attention, and not only sensuously merged with her sleeping body. The dynamic quality of the mother-infant relation includes the infant's need to introject the experience of being understood at deep psychophysical levels, but not only. This experience also plants the seed for his own later capacity for self-containment and the strengthening of his psychic skin. The only thing we know about William's early childhood is that the conflictual relationship between his parents ended in their separation. Had there been no alternative for him between sensuous, mindless entanglement and hard traumatic ruptures? Question. If William felt safer than ever before during his stay in the psychiatric ward, being discharged must have felt like yet another expulsion into nothingness, a catastrophic fall in a state of nameless dread, which in Bion's terms results from an insufficient containment of the infant's normal fear of dying. Tustin describes this traumatic premature experience as, I quote her, an unbuffered awareness of bodily separateness. At a time when the newborn infant is still in an immature state of psychic organization. End quote. Nobody knows what was in William's mind when he walked out into the ocean. Did he desperately need to get away from his abysmal loneliness and unbearable bodily separateness after being discharged from the psychiatric ward? Or was there somewhere in him a deep unconscious longing for a floating lightness, for dissolving in the fluid watery element? For, as Tustin formulates it, the unbounded timelessness of womb-like oceanic states? Tustin dedicates a chapter of autistic barriers in neurotic patients, her 1986 book, to the autistic need for, she says, spilling and dissolving, as a powerful protection against becoming a bodily and mentally separate solid human being. William did survive his suicide attempt and had to cope once more with the unbearable hardness of his psychophysical separateness. His walking into the ocean reminds me of a deeply autistic little boy in analysis with Chiara Cattelan, who works in Venice. She was the organizer of the autism conference in 2006. At an Inspira meeting, Inspira is the International Symposium for Research in Autistic States, Chiara reported that one day, at the age of 6, the child escaped his babysitter's control, ran and jumped into a canal. He was rescued by a man who had his shop nearby. What made him run and jump? I talked to Chiara the other day and asked for what she thought what had happened. Chiara thinks that the child still had a precarious sense of reality, but does not exclude that a hidden despair might have been at the origin of his act, at a time in the third year of his analysis when he was starting to look in the eyes of other persons and seemed to realize that he was separate from them. Now, deadly silences and retreats into sleep. Back to William. I was particularly struck by Louise Gyler's description of the quality of William's endless silences during his first years of analysis, which she describes as being without form. Our patient's silences can evoke a multitude of countertransference sensations. Experience teaches us to read their emotional quality, but autistic silences have a unique, deadly quality. They convey the patient's lostness, which ends up in total nothingness, as the author writes. They are deadly silences. Nothingness is about a primal void. Tustin also describes her first little autistic patient, John's, experience of the black hole, which you may all know. And Resnick writes about, I quote, the trace of a primordial absence. This is close to Green's notion of the dead mother and to René Spitz's concept of the infant's anaclitic depression with its most extreme consequence not only of psychic death, but ultimately physical death. These lifeless silences are difficult to bear and to survive, especially if over time they are no longer totally and passively autistic, but become permeated with deeply entrenched intentions of devitalizing life on a cold -K note, to say it with Bion. Louise's attempts to reclaim her patient were mostly met with more silences. Were they still pure autistic silences of nothingness, or had they become mixed with unconsciously or consciously destructive -K silences? At some point, however, silence also conveyed the impression that William felt at risk of murderous explosions if he emerged from his retreat. Explosions are hot and occur at the plus H level. Bion is explicit about the fact that hate is inseparable from love, and both are expressions of a mental state of relatedness. May the patient's fear of explosion have been among the first signs of the onset of projective identification. When he fell asleep during his sessions, we may wonder who was falling asleep. An infant who needed to experience the presence of an awake and caring mother who enveloped the child with her thoughts and attention and protected his sleep? Or did William escape into sleep in a state of panic from all words which could not be other than hard and violent? The title of Louise's paper, The Violence of the Real in Unrepresented Experience, suggests this hypothesis. William lacked a protective mental skin. The autistic armor can be seen as the most radical reaction against emotional and mental skinlessness. Words can be threatening not only when carried by angry voices, to which baby William may have been exposed in the atmosphere of his parents' conflictual relationship in his first 2 years of life, but they are intrinsically violent if there is no filter at the receiving end, no contact barrier, as Bion calls it, which makes the growth of mental safety nets, as I call them, and meaningful connections possible. Without mental filters, the individual is helplessly exposed to the unmitigated impact of the hardness and concreteness of words and emotions. Or, yet another hypothesis, in analogy to one of the possible meanings of William's silences, may his sleep also have become at some point a sign of his nascent capacity for projective identification, through which the analysis was to suffer William's state of abandonment, from which he had escaped by disappearing into nothingness. So Louise was the one who was abandoned. Another thought, words from threatening objects to harbingers of meaning. As to William's use of language, I was struck by the fact that, at least in the early period, if he did respond to the analyst's attempts to make contact, he might say something like, "Don't know," or "nothing." Not only silences, but also words can confirm nothingness, which here extends to the absence of a speaking subject. There is no I in your patient's utterings at that point. Words were used by William as hard autistic objects, or otherwise, if the analyst did affirm her separate existence by giving an interpretation, I quote her, "He dissolved into non-existence." And she adds, quote her again, "I think that this state was concretely enacted in his walking into the ocean." I couldn't agree more with the connection between the two states. If a stone is thrown into the water, it will sink and disappear. For a short time, concentric ripples on the surface will witness the event, but soon the water will be flat and smooth again, as if nothing had happened to either of them, the stone and the water. This reminds me of Louise MacNeice's poem, Prayer Before Birth, which Tustin quotes at the beginning of that very chapter on spilling and dissolving. These are the first and the last verses of MacNeice's poem. He was an Irish poet. "I am not yet born. Oh, fill me with strength against those who would freeze my humanity. Let them not make me a stone, and let them not spill me, otherwise kill me." Either or, words are too real, as William puts it. And real to his autistic self means hard, means stones which attempt to break his protective shield, means life danger. One day the analyst experienced, as we heard, and I quote her, a visceral desire to do violence to her patient by strangling him. Did her impulse have to do with the violence of words, or also with the possibility, with the possibly even more deadly violence of her patient's silences? Strangling him would have silenced him forever, instead of her being the victim of his killing silences. However, is it not possible that the analyst's impulse occurred at the very moment when, at deepest unconscious levels, something was beginning to come to life between the two of them, in the relationship? Before somebody kills somebody else, they are both alive. Could there also be a relation between the analyst's impulse to attack her patient physically and William's story about, I quote, an arrow which wounded a soldier? An arrow is not a natural object, like a stone, but a man-made penetrating weapon. Word arrows, as Louise writes. And the patient wants it taken out. In the talking cure, words are supposed to have a healing function. If they are experienced as arrows, how do we reach the patient? Autistic patients teach us patience and the capacity to keep walking for long stretches through desert land. However, in my mind, William's story of the soldier and the arrow tells amazing news about changes in his mental state. First of all, there is a narrative with a meaningful plot. And in the story, there is not only a soldier, but there are others, he says, who should not just stand around talking, but help and take the hurting arrow out. In a deep autistic state, there are no others, just as there is no I and there is no pain. Maybe the greatest breakthrough in terms of Tustin's view of the function of hard autistic protections may be the fact that the soldier is wounded. Water spills out and flows away. A stone may break, but neither of them will be injured. If there is a wound, there is a body made of flesh, and a wound causes pain, psychophysical pain. William still wanted to get rid of it, which is fair enough at the schizoparanoid level of his mental functioning. But may the wounded soldier have been the first messenger of an incipient melting of the patient's autistic frozenness and of the painful awakening of emotions? At the theoretical level, an interesting debate might develop around the position occupied by symbolic equation between concreteness and symbol proper. We know that the longer a child is encapsulated in an autistic armor and isolated from the outside world, the more traumatic and painful the impact will be once therapeutic work has helped the patient to get in touch with external reality. For years, there has been no deep, genuine learning experience and no possibility to practice modulating emotions and negotiating human relationships. Everything feels tremendously raw when the impermeable protective second skin begins to loosen. William's first dream shows how frightening unmodulated emotions are when they break forth uncontrolled and explosive after years of imprisonment. Yet he does begin his dream narrative by saying, "I was a Terminator." Self and other are now differentiated, and his multifaceted Terminator dream self is not only threatening, but also, quote Louise, hunts down monstrosities that might hurt other people or drive them mad. Is there an emerging capacity not only to have access to human feelings, but to take responsibility for his acts and even to care for others and try to protect them from a more dangerous Terminator self in his internal world? Now, my last thought will be around going back in time again about the tear. You may have seen the Mongolian documentary film, The Story of the Weeping Camel. A pregnant camel gives birth to a white calf, but refuses to nurse it. The camel baby cries for the mother in desperate shrieks and is about to starve to death. A musician is called and plays his instrument in intimate contact with the camel mother's body. She shies away, but the musician does not give up and continues to send his tunes into her body with patient determination, until tears begin to roll down from the camel mother's eyes, and she ultimately accepts to nurse her calf. Tears appear when a frozen pain begins to melt and can be shared with an empathic other. A child in a deep autistic state may have temper tantrums, but will not cry with tears. In my paper on prenatal trauma and autism, I wrote about an autistic little patient of mine. When she was just beginning to have access to non-echolalic verbal language, she wanted me for months on a row to cover her small table with a blanket. She crawled underneath and started to whisper with an almost inaudible voice. I crouched down with my ear close to the blanket and talked to her softly, saying that I was there and listened and heard her voice. One day she lifted the blanket, emerged from under the table with tears running down her face, and said, "Drops on my cheeks." Like in the camel scene, something seemed to be in a process of softening. The little girl was not yet emotionally in touch with her feelings and just commented on her wet cheeks. Yet she had produced those tears, and the tears seemed to know more than the child herself could admit at a conscious level. I saw her tears and knew that something was beginning to thaw in her frozen internal world and in our relationship. I opened my discussion of Louise's paper with the ocean and William's attempt to sink like a stone and disappear in its waters, or to merge with the waves by dissolving and liquefying himself. And I shall conclude with what I experienced as the most moving moment of the author's description of this young man's long and painful analytic process, the tear which ran down his face when she announced an unforeseeable break in the usual reliable rhythm of his sessions. A tear is the result of a conscious or unconscious pain, caused here by the announcement of his analyst's unexpected absence. William neither withdraws nor explodes. First, he tries to counteract the pain of abandonment by competing with his analyst and announcing a holiday of his own. But then he surrenders to the painful feelings of an abandoned child. The tears which run down his face bring about neither an oceanic dissolution nor a renewed autistic freezing. And his pain is profoundly different from the soldiers who needed the arrow to be taken out of his wounded body. The tear is the messenger of his distress, but also of his accepting the separation. He is sad, but his body and mind remain intact. In one of the supervision letters I received from Frances Tustin, she referred to David Rosenfeld's idea that, I quote, the earliest body image is based on the notion of liquids flowing through the body. This seems to me to link with my notion of the predecessor of projective identification of flowing over at oneness. This is still a quote from Tustin. I would add that once the child has a perception of liquids in the body, a process of transformation has set in train in terms of adorning awareness of the body's and the mind's container function, and of possible contents dwelling in the body and in his psychic internal world. William's tear is both a physical event and a psychic representation of his internal state, which he now shares with the other, although it is precisely that other, his analyst, who is the cause of his distress. It is an amazing achievement of this initially autistically withdrawn young man that he can now connect a painful emotion with a thought and describe his internal state of mourning by naming what he's experiencing with one word, a tear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this fascinating discussion, which I think gives us the opportunity to get, again, deeper into the levels of this very special and difficult analysis. Would you like, Louise, to react something to Suzanne's comment?
Just thank you to Suzanne for so capturing the pain of the patient and the agony of the work, really. So thank you very much for that. I thought you did it most beautifully. But I think I'd be now interested in other people's thoughts and comments.
So we have quite a good period of time until the lunch break, and we welcome any thoughts, reactions, remarks, either in English or in Hebrew, and we'll translate.
Okay. My name is Haliman Shalvi, and I want to thank you first for this rich and so well put together a material that caused me to write new thoughts. And I wanted to add another level which caught me about the connection between the concrete and the symbolized. I imagined this boy in his mother's bed for 8 years, needs to face his sexuality from the infantile sexuality to the adolescent sexuality, beginning of adolescent sexuality, frozen, tantalizing between unbearable wish to fuse from one side to that is transformed into a sexual wish to fuse, which I imagine registered on the psychotic level because it's so unbearable and uncontained. And I wanted to ask you if you can hear the different associations and dreams in light of the sexual drama and the soldier as the weapon. Like you said, there is a body and flesh and blood where there is a weapon. And if the weapon will injure, the explosion begins. And I thought that maybe a turning point was with the tear. No, the first one I thought that when you wanted to kill him, maybe another level of it is that you allowed yourself to be in this sexual war zone drama, to experience it. And when he had the tear, I thought that maybe he allowed himself to let go of one nozzle, of one liquid, and there was no explosion. So I wanted to.
Does anyone of you want to relate? We can try the microphone.
Oh, it's working now.
Thank you for those comments. I think there are many ways we could think about William's imagery and what we together made of it. The issue in how you imagine it with William, how far you take things with William, how much I put into words, how much I, in a way, speculated or sound? Yeah. Okay, that's like in my interpretations, I think is a technical issue, and what you take up and what you introduce. So that's one point in how we imagine. I think we've all got our own idiosyncratic associations to William's material, which is really interesting. I think we'd all work slightly differently with him. We'd all want to introduce slightly different things with him. But I think when you have a patient who is silent, who's working at a very concrete level, for me, there is a question of how much I introduce of myself and not allow a space for him to find his own words and his own imagination. But just come back to the question of sexuality. Of course, I saw William from 17 to his early 30s, and certainly he did talk more directly about sexuality and his experiences in the later part of his analysis.
Yes, thank you. I would just add one thought to the comment. I think that normal infantile erotic feelings are can be either sexualized, and that defense against a normal erotic sharing of the experience with a mother, or else it can be either hypersexualized, or it can be blocked away and become what Tustin calls auto-sensuousness, which does not differentiate between my body and your body. It's just the one fusional confusion. And so I wouldn't even, at that level, I think the term of autosensuousness is maybe more appropriate than the term of infantile sexuality. I don't know whether you agree.
We'll take different questions. Yes, Mona.
I'm wondering how you decided when to terminate the analysis.
The question is how Louise decided when to terminate the analysis. How it happened.
It's 14, yeah. The simple answer to that question is William decided. I guess for those of us who are clinicians, the paper's a bit unsatisfying because it doesn't give the sorts of details that you would like to know, like how was termination decided, how were various points around the work decided. But as I said, I saw William from 17 till his early 30s. When he started with me, his schooling had ceased when he was about 13, 14 years of age. For the first, I'll just give you the course of the treatment. The first period he saw me, he only got out of his bed to come to his sessions, and gradually, in the early years, he was able to return to a college where he could do his matriculation for university entrance and was able to go to university. A bit later than people do in a country, a couple of years older than would be ordinary, to do his undergrad. So William, towards when he was around 30, started to think that, he'd had no period of his adult life without his analysis, and decided to wonder what it would be like. Got sound? Yeah. Okay. He decided that he was curious about how he would live his life and what it would be like for him. And he decided that he would like to try. And he gave himself close to 2 years before, he set the termination date about 2 years in advance. So it was, I don't know, people would think that maybe his ending was premature. But it was William's prematurity. He decided it.
May I just add, because the 15 years resonate with me. Frances Tustin was in analysis with Bion, exactly, almost 15 years, and she decided to leave.
Do people have, people will have different thoughts about how you work at termination and questions around termination and opinions about it. So if anyone's got an opinion, I would really appreciate hearing it.
But I think it's very interesting to see this patient who had such a sense of frozen time speak of future. So to set a date in advance of 2 years is already a very different structure of his mind, having a present and a future and imagining the future and preparing him for the separation. That's a completely different mind. Yes, other questions? Yeah.
Does this work? Okay. Okay, I wanted to ask. Oh. Okay, excuse me. One thing, I was thinking of the experience of being with someone that's silent for so much, so long, so many years. And from my experience of that, working with someone that doesn't speak for years and years, I found that also that using my reverie was something very important. And I wanted to ask you how much you found yourself, in reverie and using it. And there was one example, excuse me, that in that moving moment of the tear, where I think you said, I had a thought of his desire to be like me and also take a holiday, to be similar to me. And when you said that about you, I think you even say so, that you talked about his desire, the tear came. And I thought that you asked, why did the tear come at that moment and compared to the arrow? I thought that going on with what was said before about him growing up in the bed with a mother for 8 years and all the confusion of body and sexuality and madness that infantile sexuality can create, I thought that there was perhaps something very calming and legitimizing the very idea of desire. Because you said, you want to be like me, and there was something so open and honest and accepting and non-sexual about it that perhaps created the tear. And that was after you were in reverie about why hadn't what you said previously had flattened. Okay.
At this moment, so let me see whether I can not upset the microphone. I think the challenges with my patients' silences, sometimes I actually felt dead, nothing. It was the opposite to reverie. And initially I felt quite anxious about my experience, that I felt so dead, so unimaginative, I had no thoughts, I had no feelings. Over time, I learnt to be a bit more accepting of my state of mind that often was of a no experience, of an inner emptiness or deadness. Sometimes, of course, there was a reverie, there was a thought that I could imagine something that I could use, but, you know, it wasn't consistent in any way. Thank you. What made me vary in how I approached it? Sometimes I felt, you know, utterly frustrated and upset. If I was feeling too aroused myself, I probably wouldn't have spoken then. But once I sort of worked it through a bit, I spoke to him at intermittent points. I didn't actually wake up, but I spoke something. And if he kept sleeping, he kept sleeping. And then sometimes I was just more accepting of him being asleep and let it go. He always, when I said at the end of the session, he woke up and left. But one of the things he said to me in the last... that he thanked me for keeping on talking to him. Should I? Yeah. That he thanked me for keeping on speaking to him even when he wouldn't and didn't speak to me. So I suspect when he was asleep and I spoke, he probably was on some level hearing something. But one of the issues, given that you work in a psychiatric unit, and Suzanne and I had an exchange around it. This boy was presented for treatment a number of times, the first time being when he was age 8, seen by a child psychiatrist and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and the boy was asked whether he consented to therapy, and he refused, and that was accepted. And then so we're saying he was presented at 8, and the boy was asked if he consented and said no. Again, he was seen at 13, 14 by an adult psychoanalytic candidate, according to my patient, my patient refused to talk through the year-long therapy, and it was a mutual termination because the boy refused to talk, William refused to talk. There are steps along which I think is Suzanne's point about when this William had difficulties right from early life, and the missed opportunities for help, and would it have made a difference to how he turned up at 17? and his early adult life. I don't know.
May I just add that this, I asked the question in my discussion paper about what it meant to him to sleep. And one option was that maybe he had never had a mother close to him who was thinking about him and protecting his sleep. He wanted you to talk, even if he was sleeping. He was actually saying, please, Mum, don't go to sleep with me because I need you to sing a nursery, maybe, a nursery rhyme, or just to talk to me, so you are there and I can sleep more peacefully. I don't know.
It's interesting. I often felt empty and bored with William, but I never felt sleepy.
Just a memory that came to me when you asked that question, Uri. I talked in my introduction about working with a severely regressed 17 years old autistic adolescent in a closed ward in one of the hospitals without supervision. And after a year and a half, and I succeeded to receive supervision because I didn't have that money to pay for a supervision. So I received supervision on the condition of coming another day at the hospital in a different open ward for adolescents to help the adolescents wake up. So that was my role, to come very early at 6:30 in the morning and make them wake up. And that was quite an amazing experience because they didn't feel they have had anything to wake up for. So my role was to make them have some motivation for waking up. So I was reminded about this because I used to tell them stories about them as little as I knew about them, so they had a sort of content, narrative about the day that was awaiting them, and that's somehow how they woke up. It was a sort of acclaiming them to life, the same that we do with the microphones all these days. Yes, there was a question. Yes, Tammy. Can you hear the question? No. So the question, Tammy Dror-Schreiber, the question is, what made Louise survive for such long times these very heavy silences? And what was going on inside her mind while being in such difficult moments?
Two things. There are probably more than two, but two is, I think I do have a belief in the analytic process and the importance of just being there in the experience. And I was helped in that belief by the patient and by William, who kept on coming and for whatever reason was really committed in his own way to this process. The other thing, unlike Alina, I had the privilege of having someone to talk about the case with.
That's a past experience, not present.
Yeah,
it's a past.
Yeah, that I had the privilege of being able to talk with someone who was very interested in the analytic process and had the capacity to make silence absolutely fascinating.
I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts. The problem is to express them. Yes, Danuta. Danuta from Poland.
Yeah, I think it's, crucial, isn't it?
Can you repeat the question, Louise?
The question is in relation to the importance of supervision, and I think what you're saying is the supervision functioning as a third that enables some space to reflect and think that's outside the enmeshment and fusion with the patient. And I think sometimes it's very difficult to do it for yourself.
Yes.
No. No. But I think the rhythm and musicality of the voice are really important in connecting with all patients, but particularly these sorts of patients.
Would you like to say something about that, Suzanne? I think you have...
Yes, I think it's fundamental, and we talked about it also yesterday evening at the workshop, that actually the first experience of a maternal presence is her voice, even at a prenatal age. So I definitely think that even with a sleeping patient, what you say may be important for you, but how you say it, with what kind of melody you talk to him, but also talk to yourself to keep yourself alive and awake, reaches the patient maybe more than the content of the words.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
It's a comment to the question about music. I know that older people that lost the possibility to communicate get great help by communicating by music. So maybe it's important to think about the attunement when you lost the words.
But maybe, Louise, it would be helpful if you could elaborate more on your definite no. On your definite no, because as you see, this question is repeated, and I think your no is an encapsulated answer of much more thinking.
The simple answer to the question, did I have an urge to sing? The answer to that is no, I didn't have that urge. But in a sense, I think how we use our voice, it is so very important. But I think, whether you have an urge to sing or whether you see images in visually are also personal too, aren't they? That some of us think in song, some think in visual imagery, some of us sort of have associative thoughts. It will be variable, depend on one's individuality as to where one goes.
Okay. You want to add something, Suzanne?
Yes, just to resonate with Louise, I understand that it may be difficult to go back to sort of lullaby singing with a 25-year-old autistic or post-autistic young man. It does come much more naturally with young children. The little girl I told you about, who had water on her cheeks and didn't know that she was crying yet, when she really came out of her autistic encapsulation, the first thing she wanted me to do was to sing with her. And we sort of the experience of time and of singing together. It was not unison, it was together. And it was an Italian song about the weekdays. Lunedì e il martedì. A rhythmical song about the weekdays. So time became meaningful, but we sang it together.
But your patient introduced that. Phaedra introduced her. Yeah.
Any more questions?
She was about 8. She was a child. She was not 20.
Any more questions? Yes, there. Yes. Last question, Ruti Dargish. Aloud, very aloud, please. Can you shortly repeat that and comment?
It's about the question of survival, the analyst surviving the patient's silence, and what does that do to the transformation of the patient's representation of the object?
Yes, how it helps in developing his symbolizing capacities, and the thesis was that your survival was an important agent in that transformation.
I think important. I think as Bjorn said, something about it is about learning from experience. And I think when the analyst does survive the patient's non-existence, destructiveness, hate, love, K minus K experiences, that the patient does then start to represent a containing object, an object, the purpose of a containing object that can contain all sorts of emotional experience, both positive and negative. And I think in that space, then there is the possibility to start to represent, reflect on, and think on that, and to the object to start to become differentiated. That there becomes an object that's, good, bad, loving, hating, being with you, not being with you, present, absence, that all those sorts of experience start to become differentiated, and in the experience of absence, then it can be thought about rather than acted on or retreated from.
I think we have to stop, and I would like, first of all, to thank Louise and Suzanne